Hey, this is Derek Murphy of creativity.com. I saw a question on Facebook today, which was how to write to market, or I think I figured out how to write to market, but they want some extra feedback or checking. So it's about 4 p.m. I've had my coffee. I'm going to jump into the final edits for a second book in a trilogy, Fantasy Phase series that I'm writing. And to get my brain working, I'm going to try to show you some of the stuff that I do and how I answered this question. So the first part of the response here was that when most people think about writing to market, they're usually thinking about tropes and elements that are unique to the genre. So they're thinking, what's popular right now? How do I see what's selling in my particular genre, which is, fantasy, epic fantasy, urban fantasy, and then specifically is this reverse harem werewolf, or the one I'm working on is specifically fae prison. And some of those get into trends. A trend is more what's popular in the genre, and they tend to be shorter lived. They might last a year or two, but sometimes even shorter. Sometimes authors group together to predict what they think will be a trend, and then it kind of fizzles out. Academy was a big trend a couple of years ago, and it still sort of is, but it's also sort of on its way down. And then there are the tropes, which is what readers associate with that particular genre. So these are things that let readers know that they're in the right place. So, for example, a post I wrote a couple of years ago about dystopian young adult romance, a dystopian young adult novel. These are just a bunch of elements or tropes. A revolution or rebellion is already brewing, but they need a symbol, a secret that could destroy everything. This one's a little bit too vague. So some people will say like a chosen child, the chosen one who might be lost. That's a cliche or a trope. It's overused. You see it done too often. So a lot of writers feel like, well, why should I tell a story that's already been told before? And the answer is because the chosen one trope is, sort of universal in the history of literature. There's been a lot of classic works. The thing about tropes, why they work, is because it's a way of, when you're telling a really good, satisfying story, there are a lot of common elements. And then within certain genres, that subsector, that collection of specific audience is what defines a genre. So these are things that readers have probably seen before, but are broad and vague enough that, of course, you can do it in a completely new way that they haven't seen. So they feel comfortable. It's like putting a frog in boiling water. You show them they're in the right place. You show them that this is definitely the subgenre or category that they're looking for. This is a story like the stories that they want, but then you elevate. So I say here, tropes should be sustained and elevated, same, but different. So just because you put in all of the tropes and genres, I tend to focus on over conformity. It's a term by a philosopher, Slovakia, I think, called Zizek. And basically, there is no freedom by trying to rebel. So if you're rebelling against what you think is common for your genre and you try to do something different, you've left that entire system. So you're not free to explore because you're no longer providing value. The way to do it is to identify all of the tropes and cliches and to use all of them, but then you subvert and you elevate. So you keep them, you include them, but you present them in a new way that hasn't been done before. But that's really only the first part of writing to market. It's including and even knowing what elements define the genre. If you want to try to hit that genre, you can't just say, I'm going to write sci-fi time travel. You have to see what sci-fi time travel that your audience is actually enjoying. What common elements do they share? And this doesn't mean you're copying their story or their plot. It's just generally, sci-fi time travel, you're going to have a time machine. You might have a spaceship. You're going to have to choose specific settings. But my point is this part about tropes and elements, that's what most people think is writing to market. And it isn't really. That's only the beginning. That's the stuff that defines a genre, that lets readers know that you're even in the right place. But the next really important part is the plot points. So plotting is not really genre specific. Plotting is, there's certain genres like memoir or narrative fiction or something, they don't really have strong plots. But the majority of fiction that sells, of commercial fiction, they use a very defined plot structure. It's the same structure you'll see in blockbuster movies or TV serials or pilots, especially because it's the way to organize and reveal story information in a way that makes it satisfying. So if you haven't seen this before, I did a lot of work on my plot outline, which is this. It has 24 chapters. I have lots of videos walking you through exactly all of this stuff. And people freak out because they think this is, way too defined. But if you don't know where you're going anyway, this is a pretty strong starting point. I even have a Word document you can download that has all these chapters outlined, just to kind of get you started in the right direction. And even so, these are very vague suggestions of the type of content and the structure and the organization. So like, there's a call to adventure and there's a head in the sand. So the ordinary world is shattered, which has to be set up because you can't just jump into the action without sympathizing your characters. The ordinary world is shattered, but they don't immediately go into claim their prize and go on the adventure because every action needs resistance. So they have to resist the call to adventure. They have to desperately try to get a handle back to their ordinary life and refuse the new extraordinary world. That's the head in the sand moment. And then they have to be forced out onto that new adventure. So if you cut these steps, you might still be writing the same genre, but your story won't be as satisfying or compelling as it could be if you introduced these common elements, which are pretty much universal, even though they're not often recognized, especially by new writers who are struggling. So they think right to market, I'm just going to write, what's popular or whatever, but they don't have a compelling story. You can include all the tropes and all of the elements, but if people stop reading because your stuff isn't exciting, it's not going to work. If this one is a little bit too detailed for you, I recommend starting with the plot dot, which is the most important turning points of your story, but it's a little bit shorter. It looks like this. So there's only 8 or 9 points. And this is just to make sure your story has momentum. So if you don't have these are sort of shifts in energy. These are sort of checkpoints where you stop and you reflect on who is the character, what do they need right now, what are the obstacles. So these are just little check-in points. They're sign points that let readers know that you know what you're doing. Without some sign points, the story might just keep unfurling and readers might start to become unmoored. And by unmoored, they mean they forget what's happening or why this is important. The story loses their interest. There isn't enough conflict or stakes. And they don't trust that you as the author know what you're doing to get them to a satisfying conclusion. Because like the story is fun, but it doesn't feel tight and well balanced and well paced. So they lose confidence that it's going to be worth continuing to read. And that's when they're going to put the book down. And then the other part of it, I kind of said this is the first half, this is the second half, but there's actually another really big part, which is conflict, suspense, and intrigue. These are things that most authors get wrong. So even if you have a very well plotted story, and even if it really is written to market, which means it has all the essential ingredients, that's still not enough. There has to be conflict, suspense, and intrigue, which is mostly about information management. So it's about who knew what when the reveals come, the plot twist, the surprises. That's the stuff that's really tricky to get wrong. I will say that this is also mostly in the revision or the editing stage. I'm going to show you in a moment what my manuscript looks like, the one that I'm working on. So even if I started out, this is like planning stuff. And then once you basically figure out what happens and you get down a rough draft with, sort of what happens, that stuff is still probably pretty bad. Your first rough draft is like, it's all there. It just is not satisfying. It doesn't hold the tension. There's no conflict. So a lot of this conflict, suspense, intrigue stuff, it's what I do in the revision when I'm going back and doing information management, where I'm like, this is too much information. I have to remove it and put it somewhere else where it's more important. The general rule about information is that they have to ask questions before you give them answers. So you have to build up the mystery and the intrigue and the suspense. Like, what is happening? You have to have characters asking the questions before you give them the reveals. And then you only give them one important piece of information at a time. So in one scene, there will probably be one reveal or one twist. It's only the next piece that they need to get a little bit further. It's not the full backstory dump. I'm closing in on my full backstory dump, so I'll show you sort of what that looks like and where it belongs. I think this is like the most important stuff, but it's also sort of, I want to say it's the most difficult to master. On the other hand, I've developed very clear tactics, rules, and strategies to help you to do this stuff. I have an hour-long video on this stuff on YouTube that's part of my probably like 12-hour-long free writing series on YouTube. So definitely check out that video. The point to write to market, the point of this video, what I want to kind of suggest in my opinion here is that the reason a lot of authors struggle to get their heads around right to market is because they think it means writing exactly like somebody else or copying somebody else, which is never what you should be doing. Of course, your book should be groundbreaking and unique or whatever, but the other part of it is you want to stay on the path. So you don't want to be 20 paces to the left or the right where you're so far off the path that it's no longer the genre. Or if it's something like speculative fiction, a lot of times authors will eschew plotting or suspense or intrigue. Maybe they think, I included all the elements. I definitely wrote to market. I even use a plot point, but their books aren't selling. They're not getting good reviews, and they can't figure out why. It's almost always going to be this stuff, which is why I think it's really important. Or, of course, if it's not selling, it's going to be your cover or your blurb or your lack of reviews. So this is only like, reader satisfaction or engagement after they've bought the book. If you're looking at it from a purely publishing or marketing standpoint, it's all going to be about the cover design, the blurb, and having enough reviews. If you don't have those, of course, your book isn't selling. That's what you have to fix. But if you have those and your books are selling and you're just not getting the traction or the engagement, or read through is really weak from book 1 to book 2, that's when this stuff becomes more important. So I'm going to attempt to jump over here to my manuscript, and hopefully you can see it. Probably the video is small because I have a really wide screen, so it probably makes everything look small. I'm going to keep this over here. This is Right to Market. This is the manuscript I'm currently working on. This is a book 2 in a series that I'm writing with a co-author, and we've had the rough draft for probably over a year. I've just been editing it. So I'm a really deep editor. It takes me a long time to go through. And like I mentioned, the first draft is like, it's fun, it's all there. But I really love to focus on the second, third, and fourth draft to get it to really where I want it. So you can probably already tell, I don't have exactly 25. I have like 24 chapters and an extra wrap-up scene, which is about the same that I recommend in my 24 chapter plot outline. My chapters are about 3,000 to 4,000 words with roughly 2 scenes. I try to keep it at 2 scenes. Sometimes that doesn't always fit exactly. And then as I go through, I will tend to figure out what has to happen in the chapter. And that's why I like my chapter, I very roughly leave myself notes so that I can quickly look through the navigation and just, check what is the important thing that happens. And then when I get stuck, I make a little outline where sometimes if you're stuck and you're trying to just, get your head around a certain section, I will just make a little outline and it'll be a bullet point or a numbered list where I just go through, step by step what happens next to get rid of all the fluff and the distracting stuff. These are just, how does the story move forward? And I do that a couple times whenever I get stuck. And then once I've written that section and figured it out, I'll go back and delete the stuff. I also have sections for extra notes, extra scenes, powers I'm trying to keep track of. This I've been working on for a while, so I have notes too, face story, backstory, other stuff, stuff that I've cut, especially now that I've got about 3 days to upload this book, and I'm not close, so the next few days are going to be critical, but I'm closing in, and I have enough experience to know that I'll probably be able to pull off, maybe not absolutely perfect, but it should be clean enough and it should be pretty much most of the story. Sometimes there's stuff that like, I know I have things that I want to include to make it even better, but it just doesn't fit, or it would take too much reworking to go through. When you add one thing, you have to, make sure the whole manuscript remembers. So sometimes I'll have extra details that I plan to fix eventually, or when I finish the whole series, the box set, and I'm going through it again to fine tune the details a little bit. I also do pretty light formatting as I go. So even though these are super rough, they're starting to become clean enough. Like this still needs a final, it still needs a final round of revision. I'll risk showing you some of my notes because my notes are really super rough comments to myself. They're all spelled poorly, I swear. Sometimes it's just like, what the hell, or this doesn't make sense, or whatever. Mostly my questions are like, either I'm asking questions and sometimes I'm answering my own question. So I'll have a comment like this needs fixing or why what is happening, and then when I go back through my revisions, I'll just write the answers here. So here I have like, why do they keep attacking? It's like a plot-based question. Then I get the answer. So when sometimes if I'm revising, it's hard to just jump into the story and start writing. But I can go over here in the comments and I can just write a scene. It might be 500 words or something. I'll just write it right in the comments. And then when I go back through later for a final revision, I'm almost through with it, probably like the second revision. This is where I'm doing the heavy revision and the editing, where I'm adding significant new comments and moving things around. I've got, 5 more chapters. This is also, I add little asterisks here for the chapters I'm working on. That's just another way I keep track of like where I am. So I'm on this chapter and I'm going towards this chapter. That's what I'll be working on today. And then I have like 5 more chapters of heavy rewriting and revision I'll get to in the next day or two. After that, it's just going through and cleaning up all of my notes and answering questions. Often like description is another thing. I have another video that's like my editing process, and I have a 3-step editing process, and description is one of the last steps of my editing process. So once I have everything in place, I know what happens, then I will, finally focus a little bit more on what does everything look like. It is important to figure out where the scenes happen. I'll probably mention that in a minute, but I might make little notes to myself about, descriptive snippets or elements, and then I'll go back and add those in. So the final polish will be after I finish this heavy revision, I'll go back through the comments again and just make sure everything's pretty good. Then I'll do my final proofread, try to just read through the whole thing and look for typos and mistakes. I'll probably also use the Grammarly plugin to do a final check, and then I'll send it out to the new ARC readers. And it should be pretty clean, but there are always, a handful of typos that make it through. Recently, I've been focused a little bit more on satisfying resolution. So I wrote an article for the NaNoWriMo blog about that, basically like how to finish your book, but a lot of it is about satisfying conclusions. And there's a really cool element I talk about where you can set up a satisfying conclusion or resolution by increasing the resistance, by introducing a rule, a hard character rule at the beginning of the book. So it's sort of like a mirror or a foil, where in the beginning of the book, you show a circumstance the character is unsuited for. It's impossible for them to complete the task because of a childhood trauma or a deep-seated fear or something. So the circumstance or the scene or the event in very early in the book just shows the character lack. They can't do this thing because, and you don't have to give the full backstory and description. You just show that this is a problem for them. This is something they cannot do. At the end of the book, they will face a similar situation and they will have to overcome their deep-seated trauma or fear. And this will probably be like in the middle of a battle scene where you will have the flashback and you will finally do the backstory reveal, so that they can do that inner healing that they need, because they have to, the way to write a satisfying novel or book is that it has to be a story difficult enough that it forces the character to change. So the point is that, through the plot events, the character is changed. To make it satisfying, you have to make the stakes big enough and difficult enough that it forces that change. And it can't be easy enough that they can just go and do all the things and win. It has to be so difficult. It's an impossible task. It destroys them and forces them to become more. That's what I think is really important for satisfying commercial fiction. So that's a little deeper than like right to market because that's not something everybody talks about. I have a book called Bookcraft where I go really deep, but I also have some stuff like the Tomorrow War that I just wrote. It's just a quick like breakdown of the Tomorrow War, but it introduces a lot of the key elements from Bookcraft. And I have another long post on writethemagic.com about satisfying character arcs. Because, when you break down Netflix shows or movies, you'll see the same handful of really powerful writing tools that are being used over and over again because that's how you do dramatic storytelling. So, partly just for myself, because I'm going to get back to writing and I want to kind of keep this fresh of mind, let me talk you through some of the changes I just made and some of the changes I'm going to make in the next couple of days to make sure that this story has a satisfying story resolution and wrap up. This is difficult because this is a book two. Sometimes book twos are a little bit weaker because you don't have, the setting up the story world and you don't have the final epic conclusion, which are probably things you've thought through. And the other part is like normally by the end of book one, they sort of know the basic rules of the universe. So it can be difficult to keep the momentum tight in a book two because it's not only, the stakes and the pressure and the dangers, but also the unknowns and the mysteries that they don't know what's happening. So there's a lot of stuff I love in this book, but like a lot of the like deep fae mythology, the ancient history stuff that is my favorite part, I have to resist giving any of that away until closer to the ending. And what I really need to focus on is just stripping enough. So for most of this book, um, there's been like I had to set it up with some hard conflict. So the basic premise of this book is they discover she's a fairy princess and they tell her like she needs a court. So unless she gets married soon to some prince, then she'll probably be assassinated because the fairies want to get rid of her. So that sets up some immediate, danger. But then the majority of this book is, and it's fun stuff, but she's basically, going to ball dances and living in different castles. I really focused a lot on cool scene building. There's a lot of really awesome visual scenes I'm excited about, but it's a little harder to keep up the pacing and the tension without things happening. So in this case, it's easier because there's a lot of conflict between the characters. All of the Fae are kind of vindictive jerks. The people that she's living with, she goes from like one almost abuser and then a bunch of fairy princesses who are just cold and mean to her. So she's dealing with a lot of abuse, just trying to kind of fit in. So even like, and this is common in commercial fiction, when she gets to the extraordinary world, she can't just be, she'll probably have a couple of friends that are outcast like her, but she's going to receive a lot of bullying, kind of, because she has to earn her place. So even though this is a book two, she's in a new environment. She's still adjusting and learning the rules and trying to figure some things out. There are a couple of attacks. So she goes to, there's basically a fight at a party where a couple of guys are fighting over her. So it's not huge conflict, it's understated conflict. You're showing the tension, but it doesn't erupt into violence. Then you have, this is about halfway through. I haven't marked like my midpoint, but I try to keep track of where my midpoints are. So about halfway through, there's a hunt. She goes hunting. She's kind of thinking maybe this is her chance to escape because it's the first chance she's had to go into the human world and be big again. So she, almost tries to escape, but gets attacked and stabbed. She uses her magical powers and she kills a guy. So there's a lot of conflict, but this is like halfway through the book where not much has, I mean, a lot of things happen, but there's not been any outright violence. It's been understated violence. So it's been pretty slow for one of my books. The midpoint is generally where the character will stop being afraid and they'll take a more proactive role. It doesn't mean they understand everything, although it is a good place to add a really good plot twist by giving out extra information. This isn't the video to talk about that. I have tons of videos walking through in much greater detail the different plot points, the midpoint especially. But I do try to keep track because this is a big difference where she starts to stop trying to run backwards to her ordinary world life and start to accept she just has to learn how to take care of herself so she has more control. So things only finally start to get moving pretty late. That's why I think this book has been really hard for me, because it's good. I'm really happy with it. I think it's great, but it's slower. So I had to do a lot more description, world building, and the subtle stuff. Like, it's all there. The characters are there. The scene description is great. But if a scene doesn't have conflict, the conflict has to be unstated or understated. So it could be banter, it could be conversation, it could be threats, or it could be just, even in like in one of these scenes, basically, she goes to live with another Fey prince who's a nice guy, and it's beautiful, and everything is just awesome. But you have to find a way of increasing conflict. So I have some things like, she kind of likes him, but she doesn't know how he feels about her. So he says a couple things that confuse her. So she's just trying to figure out how he feels. So raising those questions or that uncertainty or that anxiety, that can be enough sometimes. But anyway, down here, there's another ballroom party, but this time she has this unique power which allows her to stop time, which she hasn't really told anyone yet. And there's some guy, like time stops, but this time she didn't do it, and she sees some guy who shouldn't be there. So she suddenly gets attacked by this guy. Um, so I had to do a few things, because I don't want to just immediately, like, of course she gets attacked, who is the guy? All of the characters would just, like, what normally would happen is all the characters just talk about all the things, but you never want your characters to talk about what's happening, because they'll always get to the truth. If you have enough characters with enough information and they always just sit around and try to figure things out together, they'll always figure out an answer if they share. So what you have to do is increase the conflict or obscure the motivation, so that there are a lot of raised questions without any volunteered information, so that the characters, what I have basically, she gets attacked, but nobody believes her that she saw the guy stop time, because time travel or stopping time, I guess, is a big, scary, dark power that's not supposed to exist. So nobody wants to believe. It's sort of a Voldemort thing where nobody wants to believe that he's back. And not everybody even knows about this Fey mythology because it's ancient, ancient stuff. And then building up to, pretty soon, I'm going to have to start talking about this ancient mythology stuff. But if it's not common knowledge, I have to figure out who would actually know this ancient stuff. So what I have happen, I haven't done this well, but it was kind of a necessary band-aid, where in this party, when she gets attacked and time stops, she sees the guy drop an old book, and then she goes and picks it up before she starts time again. So now everybody's trying to figure out, what's happening, how do we respond, who was this guy, what did he want? And most people just say the guy was here to assassinate her because other assassins have already attacked her before. And she knows that's not really true, because he didn't attack her until after she saw him. So she knows he was looking for something else, and she found this book. She doesn't know what to do with it yet, but I have to have her holding that information so it'll become relevant later. I had to find a way to give her that information. So it's not perfect, but he drops a book. It's fine. It's going to work. I have to really focus on all of those questions, because, and I'll show you what this looks like, I think. So I have the party. Excuse me while I scroll for a minute. So I have the results of the party is, they basically say she's too much, like, people keep trying to kill her, and this time they attacked her at a fancy royal ball and put people in danger. So they were really trying to hold on to her because she's kind of a rare princess. But suddenly things change, and they're ready to just send her back to the human world to fend for herself, because she's not worth the risk anymore, which is kind of a big drop. And then they decide, like, for now, let's just spend the night and think it over. So they fight for a while. They decide they're all going to stay in guest rooms. And then this is what I was working on last night. So that the problem that I knew I was facing in this next scene is that she's basically going to go and snoop and eavesdrop. and here's some other stuff, and here's some things that point her in the right direction, so she'll be forced to take action. But I have to justify that motivation really strongly, which you do by raising questions. So I haven't fleshed any of this stuff out yet. It's really rough notes, but these are basically just lists of questions. And the other thing is, immediately after an attack, immediately after violence, is not the place to be thinking through things. They're bleeding. They've got to, get out of danger, make sure everyone's safe, change clothes or whatever. So they're not just going to sit around and have a powwow and ask questions. And I had to resist the answers because I'm not ready to give the answers yet. So even though they had a big discussion, she didn't really learn any truths. Instead, she became aware that, there's some weird stuff going on. The other characters aren't telling her the truth. They're obviously lying. The guy who came, she doesn't know who he is or why he has a weird power. She now knows that that power is a weird power. And I changed it so that she hasn't told people yet because I know they're going to freak out when she can do it too. So now she knows that the power she has is kind of a weird, dangerous, dark power, which adds some intrigue. She knows that the guy was searching for something. She knows that a couple of the characters are hiding things for her, from her, and they know more than she's telling. So she's basically just in bed asking herself questions, unable to sleep because she has all of these pressing, anxious issues, which is what I need, because you need the character to have downtime. They're not going to remember and think through things until they have downtime. So you need to have a break and get them somewhere where they have downtime, where they feel safe enough to reflect and think and discover things. So maybe there's something earlier that they haven't noticed yet. And once they start asking the questions, that's when they can, you ask the questions before you reveal the answers, because otherwise they wouldn't just stumble into the answers. You have to show them asking the questions and show them being annoyed or anxious about the gap in knowledge, so that they are searching their brain and then they can put something together. So she has sort of an epiphany, or at least she's motivated enough. Tomorrow they're going to have to figure out what to do with her. She's still going to be in danger. She's got to take action and figure out what's going on. Anyway, so I need to finish this stuff so there's enough justification to send her out into danger, snooping around and eavesdropping, because that will lead to the next scene, which is where she gets caught. And this is another scene I'm going to have to do really delicately, because she's going to overhear a couple of the other characters and sort of misinterpret their intentions. So she has to know that something's up and they're trying to do something. They're trying to do something important and dangerous, and she's in the way. But she doesn't know exactly what it is, because they're not exactly the real bad guys. But she doesn't know that. She thinks they are. So that's specific to this book. But you don't want to give away all of the answers before the final battle scenes. You don't want to have a full backstory reveal or whatever before the final battle scenes. The full reveal is really after the final battle scenes. And there are two major final battle scenes which shift, because one is a failure due to incomplete knowledge. The other is more of a success. So she interrupts this clandestine meeting. She hears basically what they're planning. They have to go and do something right away. That sounds terrible. The stakes have to be really big, so I have to find a way of making it sound bad enough without giving away too much. So it has to be something like, basically the backstory is that there's this ancient princess and there's an ancient ruined kingdom that nobody talks about, and there are 4 magical fae artifacts. But that's a lot, and she doesn't need all that information right away. What she needs is the motivation to take action. So she doesn't need the information about why these things are happening. She doesn't have to understand it. She just has to feel the pressure. So she hears that these 2 characters are going back to the fairy prison to look for some magical artifact that has something to do with something like the destruction of the human world. And this is where I'm going to have to get the wording just right so that she understands the threat. Whoever has these 4 magic artifacts can destroy the human world and the fairies will take over the world, something like that. So she has to think like, oh no, I have to take action to stop them because my friends and family in the human world are in danger. She has to at least, like, the stakes have to be really, really big to force her desperate action. So she is saved by a friend. There's some more downtime where she goes back to the human world to regroup and discuss and to plan, where basically she says, like, we have to go stop them from breaking into the prison and stealing this thing because the fate of the world is at stake. That's her limited belief, but it has to be there for now. You should read the Tomorrow War post because the point was basically the Tomorrow War is I thought it was good. A lot of people think it's good, but people also notice it's completely ridiculous because the plot holes are so bad and so obvious. And the problem is those plot holes were necessary to tell that story. So sometimes it's okay to have a lot of plot holes as long as you keep it moving fast enough, as long as you get to the end for your final battle scenes. So it doesn't always have to be perfect, especially in fiction. Most readers aren't going to notice all the plot holes that you notice. You do want to make sure that the motivation is there, but it doesn't have to make sense. So, you have to make it make sense in the context of what the character knows and who the character is, that they will risk their lives or their friends' lives to stop the bad things from happening. And so this is the chapter where I basically have to start giving away some of the backstory. I have this whole chapter that's just on backstory. And basically, now that she knows what they're really up against, which is what happens after the first failed final battle scene, where there's an accounting of their, I forget the right word, but like their weaponry. They count their arsenal and they come up short. They count, what the bad guys are trying to do and what they have to do to stop them. And the bad guys have an army and we're just 4 orphans or whatever. This is impossible, but we have to do it anyway because there's nobody else. So they take an accounting and they know that they have a lack or a limitation and they decide to put themselves in danger anyway because the stakes are high enough that it forces the risk. So that's what all has to be kind of done pretty well. The problem, like I mentioned, is that none of these characters should know any of that stuff. And I don't want her to overhear too much earlier when she's listening, because if they overhear too much, it'll take away from the urgency. You really the urgency is like how fast the bad things are going to happen. The intrigue or the suspense it comes from not knowing information. So I can't have them learn too much information because it will take away the intrigue and the suspense. But I do want to give them a partially better understanding. And the challenge was in the backstory that the characters wouldn't have any reason to have this information, which is why I had to force that extra book in there. It's basically the bad guy drops an old book. The old book has some old mythology that's relevant. So now in this backstory scene, I can have her give the book to one of her fairy allies. The fairy ally can basically maybe not read all of it, but skim through a little bit and parse out a few key crucial points of information, like a quick summary. And she may have heard like some of this stuff before, but this is new information that is not well known, because if it was well known, if everybody knew this information, it wouldn't be secretive. There wouldn't be any danger. There wouldn't be any. The reason that she is locked up for overhearing the information is because it's stuff that is secret. So this backstory gives context to the limited information that she overheard earlier and fills in the picture of what they think is happening. So they already have the stakes, the motivation. And actually, I'm kind of only realizing this right now. Sometimes it really helps me to just talk through my plot points, because when I get stuck, if I just talk through it all, I can get unstuck sometimes. Like you'll notice the one problem and then you can just fix it. So I think what I just have realized in this process, I was talking about the stakes that needed to be earlier here, the whole fate of the human world. It doesn't actually have to come that early. The urgency doesn't have to come that early because there's nothing she can do with that urgency right now. She just has to know where they're going, basically, and what they're after. She can get caught, she can escape, and then once they have the status quo, they're safe for the moment. She doesn't know what's really going on, but now they have the book, they can fill in some of the backstory. So rather than needing to be very ambiguous about what these characters were saying in this scene, I could just have the extra information come in this backstory reveal here where they have the book, and this makes it easier for them to mistake the intentions of those other side characters, because like I mentioned, they're not the real bad guy. So the way to have a good, satisfying twist is before the final battle scene, they can't just know exactly what's going to happen. There's always a piece of information, a critical piece of information that they didn't know. Because even going into the final battle scene where they think they know what's going on, they would try to be prepared. They would try to have the upper hand. They wouldn't they want to go into the final battle scene prepared to lose everything, but with a smart enough plan that they try to avoid conflict, because reasonable characters will avoid conflict. However, even in the final battle scene, there's always a crucial piece of information they did not know, which leads to the final twist where the villain is basically winning the final battle scene. And in a movie, what would happen at the end of a final battle scene, at the final conclusion, is the hero at the mercy of the villain. They've lost the battle, but then the hero reaches into themselves and finds some lost power or memory, or usually it's just an internal shift which forces them to take action in a way that they wouldn't have done before and go that extra mile. In Neo, I'm blanking on the Neo Matrix. Matrix is the thing. So Mr. Smith asks Neo, why do you keep getting up? Why don't you just stay down? And Neo says, because I choose to, and that's all, because he has free will and he chooses. It's usually something like that, the power of love, or because I have friends or family or whatever. It's usually just kind of a feel-good thing where the hero's motivation is more pure or ethical than the villain's motivation. And that's why he has, that extra determination to see it through. Something like that. But anyway, given what she overheard earlier and given the backstory fill-in details about, they're after these artifacts, and then here, these artifacts, when combined, can destroy the human world. Now they assume that these characters are going to destroy the human world, and that's what motivates them to take immediate action, even if it has to be done. They're not prepared at all for this conflict, but there's no time. Someone has to stop them, so they go. And then there's the final battle scene. This battle scene is huge. Like, it's a whole chapter of fighting and magic and swordplay. It's hard to do an epic battle scene with limited characters. So there's like a 7-person battle scene. And the hard part is it's not just conflict. It's not just fireballs and swords. There's pacing involved in battle scenes. I think I made a video recently or a blog post about how to write a final battle scene. It might be on Creativity, or it's up on how to write satisfying conclusion. That's probably it. There's a pacing involved in your final battle scene. It's not just one thing. It's got to be stretched out. And also, again, with the Tomorrow War thing, the ridiculous thing about the Tomorrow War is that the ridiculous but necessary thing is that it goes from, giant guns like semi-automatic weapons that can't even kill one alien down to fist combat. So they have, first they have a vial that can just kill the alien, but of course they don't use it. Then they blow up the entire ship, but of course it doesn't kill the queen. Then they use semi-automatic rifles. They switch to pistols, and then they get down to fist combat with like an ice pick, which is ridiculous, but that's common in fight scenes because your final fight scene, like when you're just killing bad guys, the bad guys are not important. The final battle scene is a personal conflict between very motivated characters, the very motivated villain and the very motivated hero. And you can't have a final battle scene end quickly due to overwhelming power. You can't just have one stronger character who just beats the other character. So they have to appear to be almost evenly matched. And then it's just the hero's extra drive or determination that gets them over the final finish line. And because that's like the whole point of your book, is that final goalpost. It's the resistance and tension between the forces of evil and good. It's not just a snap. It's not a shotgun blast or whatever. It's a enduring, lengthening rubber band that you pull and pull and pull. Things slow down in slow motion. That they're forced in a smaller space together, where they're forced to fight hand-to-hand combat, because you want to focus on, that's the battle. You want to focus on the small, intimate details. So I have that final battle scene. The final battle scene for most novels, unless it's the final conclusion, is going to be a deferred survival rather than an imminent victory, which just means, they're going to not die. That's basically the goal. The goal of this book. They learn a lot of new things. There's a lot of surprises and twists as they figure everything out. They become stronger through the journey, but they don't defeat the antagonist because this is a series. There's going to be another final book. At the end of this book, they just know who the antagonist is, or at least they're starting to know. In book 3, like, I'll save a lot of this information for book 3 because you don't want book 3 to also just be about action. Like I mentioned, if you give away too much information, you take away the suspense and the intrigue. I need new suspense and intrigue, which means I need new unanswered questions in book 3 also. I can't just give all the information in book 2. But basically, the fight, they survive. They lose one of the critical weapons, but they have a better understanding about who their allies are, who the antagonists are, what's really at stake. And now they have an agenda, going into book 3. They know what they're up against and what they have to do. And then book 3 is basically going to be more of a scavenger hunt. This is something I use a lot in my books. I overuse it, but it works really well. In my mermaid book, there are also four magical artifacts they have to track down. And so, like, books 1, they're just getting used to things. Books 2, they're learning what's at stake and who the villain is and, like, piecing out all this information. Book 3, they have to, and this is basically Harry Potter. And, now that they know Voldemort's back and they know about the Horcruxes, in book 6 and 7, it's just about going around and finding. It's a race to collect the Horcruxes, basically, leading up to the final battle scene. So just because it's overused, just because it's like an obvious trope, doesn't mean you should avoid it, because it's useful. It's going to make a very satisfying, book where it gives them a reason. You also want them, the reason it works really well is you don't want them just sitting around the same scenes. Even in your book 3, you want them to go to new places and have new descriptions and scenes that, don't just feel like we're sitting in the same room all the time. So you have to give them a reason to explore the world and discover cool new places. So even if it's not like, I have to retrieve 4 magic artifacts, there's probably some kind of quest involved. It could be like a bank robbery quest or a heist quest where they have to assemble a team to go and steal the thing. That's enough for like a whole book, if you know what you're doing. Or it could just be like, this is my goal. In order to do that, we have to get these ingredients to be able to pull off our objective. And you don't want the ingredients to be easy to find. Whatever it is that they have to do, the way to stretch it out, like you can't just start a book, gather the ingredients, and go fight the bad guy, because the book would be too short. So everything they have to do, every goal, every next step has to be resisted with at least 3 obstacles and a lot of conflict. It can't just be, if they have to drive across town to pick up their daughter, then you have an earthquake and you have a dinosaur and you have the car runs out of gas or gets hit by a bus or someone steals your car or whatever. You make the simple goal into a whole episode, a difficult, traumatic episode with conflict. That's just the easy way to extend. Like a whole book could just be one goal. They just have to go and do one thing. But the way to keep the whole book satisfying is to just keep inventing new points of conflict and obstacles for them to overcome. So instead of just going straight there, they have to take a massive detour, and go through a lot of small mini quests. Anyway, I'm going to end this video here and get to writing. Hopefully I said some things that will make it helpful. I don't always talk about my writing this way, but I think it is kind of useful. So I may do more stuff like this. Let me know if you enjoyed it in the comments, or what you're writing, or any other questions you have about writing to market. Thanks. Bye-bye.